Should we abolish the Electoral College? Okay, look, to be honest, I had kind of planned this video thinking that if Trump won the presidency, he wouldn't also win the popular vote, given his previous election results. Regardless, I've worked too hard on this video to scrap the whole thing, so I'm releasing it anyway. Let's get into it. The Electoral College is something that is uniquely American. Rather than directly electing the President of the United States via popular vote, the US head of state is elected by gaining enough electoral votes to become president. These electoral votes are earned by winning states, and each state has a different number of electoral votes to be won based on its total population. If you live in the United States, this concept is hopefully all too familiar to you, especially as we're currently recovering from an extremely bumpy election season. But if you live outside the US, an electoral college may be something you've never heard of before. That's because, according to Pew Research Center, the only other democracies that indirectly elect a leader who serves as both head of state and head of government, similar to the US president, are Botswana, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, South Africa, and Suriname. Switzerland also has an indirectly elected executive body with a collective presidency chosen by its parliament. So why is that the case? Are we living in the past? Is it time perhaps for America to move on from the Electoral College? In today's video, I'll be exploring the cases both for and against the abolition of the Electoral College, as well as whether something like that could ever actually happen. But first, let's go over a little bit of history to familiarize ourselves with where these ideas came from. Before we get into whether the Electoral College is still necessary today, we first need to understand where it comes from. The Founding Fathers of the United States established the idea of the Electoral College in the Constitution, and it was created, at least in part, as a compromise between the election of the president by a vote in Congress and election of a president by a popular vote. Interestingly enough, while the idea was brought up by the Founding Fathers, the term Electoral College never actually appears in the Constitution. Instead, Article 2 of the Constitution and Amendment 12 both refer to the electors, but never to the Electoral College. Anyways, to understand more about the origins of the Electoral College, the Election Assistance Commission, who published a fun paper on this whole thing which you can find in my sources down below, argues that we need to get into the mindset of what it was like to live back in 1787. Back in the day, the United States started as 13 colonies. Our flag only had 13 stars. Most of you probably already know this, so I won't spend too much time on it. That's important though, because back in this time, around 4 million people lived in this new country. This meant that deciding the president by popular vote back then would have been a logistical nightmare, especially for a country that was just finding its footing while also rapidly expanding. That's not even the main reason that the Electoral College was implemented though. When the Constitutional Convention was all said and done, according to the Election Assistance Commission, quote, "The founders believed that state loyalties could trump the best interest of a national government and that it would be difficult to elect a candidate with national prestige. If a candidate was required to win states instead of just popular votes, however, it would be more likely that he would have wide-ranging support outside his home state. This was a concern for smaller states that feared the domination of the presidency by states with larger populations. To add to that, support for popular elections in general was not all that popular amongst some of the founders. While some believed a popular vote for the president was the right move, others thought that the public should have a much smaller role in deciding, hence the compromise of the Electoral College. But surely the system has changed over time, right? There's no way we're running on the same system that was built all the way back in 1787. Nope, it's pretty much set up the same way it was back then, albeit with a few exceptions. In fact, the only time the Electoral College was modified by a constitutional amendment was in 1804, when the 12th Amendment was ratified. The 12th Amendment basically revised and more thoroughly outlined the procedure by which the president and vice president are elected, or more specifically, so that they are elected together. There are a bunch more details to the 12th Amendment that I'm not going to go into because they don't really matter for this video. If you want to learn more about it, check out my sources down below. As for other changes to the Electoral College, there haven't been too many historically. States have changed voting processes here and there, and in 1961, the 23rd Amendment provided Washington, D.C. 3 electors of its own. With that brief historical outline in mind, it's now time to go through the best arguments made by both sides to abolish or keep the Electoral College, beginning with the best case for abolition. Perhaps the strongest case for the abolition of the Electoral College is how unpopular it seems to be among the American public. According to a survey conducted by the Pew Research Center in September 2024, 63% of a group of 9,720 respondents said that the United States should switch from the Electoral College to a popular voting system to determine who wins the presidency. Meanwhile, only 35% of respondents said that the Electoral College should be kept. 12% of respondents were unsure. This isn't a trend that's split entirely by party lines either, though the idea of a popular voting system is more popular amongst Democrats. According to the survey, 8 in 10 Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents favor replacing the Electoral College with a popular vote system. Meanwhile, amongst Republicans, it's about a 50-50 split, with 53% saying they favor keeping the Electoral College, while 46% would prefer to replace it. Also, if you think this is a recent trend, think again. According to the National Archives, public polling showed that 58% of respondents favored its abolition all the way back in 1967. In 1968, that number shot up to 81%. In 1981, it was still at 75% and has fluctuated since, but polls have pretty much always shown that the majority of Americans want the Electoral College gone. These polls don't address the why, though. Why do the majority of Americans not support the system? It comes down to a few reasons. The first of which is that the possibility of electing someone who doesn't receive the majority of votes is fully there. This has happened 5 times in US history, most recently in 2016 when Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton even though Clinton won the popular vote. Outside of that, the only other election in the past 100 years or so to have a result like this was the election of 2000, where George Bush defeated Al Gore. In other words, while it isn't very likely for a candidate to win the presidential election without winning the popular vote, the possibility is still there. When discussing abolition, many argue that it's also important to point out that the Electoral College could be suppressing voter turnout. The logic behind this argument is fairly simple. Since states are guaranteed the same number of electoral votes regardless of how many people actually show up to the polls, people may feel like it's not necessary for them to go vote for the next president. This argument can be taken even further for those who don't live in swing states. For reference, the 2024 election was basically decided by 7 swing states: Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. For someone who lives in a deeply blue or deeply red state, say like California or Alabama, what is the incentive to get out and vote for the next president? Obviously, the presidential election is paired with a whole host of other ballot measures, but will people truly be persuaded to go vote on those issues if their presidential pick doesn't matter? It's an important question to consider, and it's probably a bit demoralizing for people living in deep blue or deep red states that their presidential votes don't really matter as much as some others. And that actually segues perfectly into the final point that's in favor of abolition. Opponents of the Electoral College argue that it's set up in such a way that it overrepresents those living in rural states. A prime example of this can be seen in the election of 1988, when, according to the Gilder-Lehrman Institute of American History, quote, the combined voting age population of the 7 least populous jurisdictions of Alaska, Delaware, the District of Columbia, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming carried the same voting strength in the Electoral College as the 9,614,000 persons of voting age in the state of Florida. Each Floridian's potential vote then carried about 1/3 the weight of a potential vote in the other states listed. This phenomenon can be seen today as well. For example, using the power of vote fractions, it can be determined that a vote in the state of Wyoming is worth about 3.6 times more than a vote in the state of California. I can't go into all the details about how this number was calculated, but if you want to learn more about it, I'd highly recommend reading the article What's My Vote Worth by Oliver K. Ernst. It's linked down below in my sources. Those are the 3 strongest arguments for the abolition of the Electoral College. But of course, we must now examine the other side and take a look at the best arguments for keeping the Electoral College. Let's get into it. Much like the case for abolishing the Electoral College, the case for keeping the Electoral College has a solid argument as well. For one, if the Electoral College were to be done away with, we would need to consider what the alternative may look like. A true popular vote would decide the president purely on whoever received more votes. Now, that may seem simple on the surface, but what would happen if the election were extremely tight? In short, proponents of the Electoral College argue that a true popular vote would create a potential nightmare scenario when it comes to recounts. Imagine a scenario where one candidate wins the popular vote over another by only a few 100,000 votes. Instead of just having a recount in 1 or 2 states, like we do in especially tight Electoral College races, every single state would have to go back and count their votes again. There would be court cases, challenges to votes, and potential chaos across the country. Proponents of the Electoral College say that this would make for a logistical nightmare. Even while the current system isn't perfect, they argue that a potential alternative would make things far worse. Another argument that proponents of the Electoral College make is that the current system ensures national unity by requiring a broad base of popular support to secure the presidency. This is sort of the rebuttal to the argument that voters in Wyoming have more voting power than voters in California. Without requiring a broad base of support, Electoral College proponents say that presidents would be chosen either by the dominance of a single populous region over others or by large metropolitan areas overshadowing rural communities. And as we've already discussed, that is technically true. A final argument heard in favor of the Electoral College comes down to the power of the states. In other words, they claim the Electoral College maintains a system system of federal representation of sorts because in a formal federal structure, the important political powers are the ones that are left to the states. Another way to think about it is this. Proponents argue that abolishing the Electoral College in favor of a nationwide popular vote for president would undermine the federal structure established by our Constitution and result in a more centralized national government, ultimately harming the states. They also trust that the Founding Fathers thoughtfully debated the original design of our federal system and concluded that the perspectives of individual states hold greater significance than those of political minorities. On top of that, they believe that the collective views of state populations are more valuable than the opinions of the national electorate as a whole. Hopefully that made sense, as that's pretty much how those in favor of keeping the Electoral College argue their points. Let's take a time out for a second though. Is this even worth discussing? Have I completely wasted your time? Would the Electoral College ever actually be abolished, or is it just a fever dream for some? It's time for us to find out how realistic an idea like this actually is. As I've already mentioned in this video, the words Electoral College aren't directly mentioned in the Constitution. However, electors are, and the format for presidential elections is pretty clearly laid out. But that doesn't mean there aren't necessarily loopholes, and those loopholes could be what one day leads to getting rid of the Electoral College without passing an entirely new constitutional amendment. For example, while the process is described in the Constitution isn't entirely explicit about how the votes need to be awarded. While 48 states have adopted a winner-takes-all strategy for their electoral votes, 2 states have not, Nebraska and Maine. Have you ever wondered why Nebraska's electoral votes and Maine's electoral votes are divided up into 3 different sections for electoral votes? For example, Kamala Harris took 1 electoral vote from Nebraska's 2nd congressional district this past election, while Trump took the remaining 4 electoral votes in the state. Why is that? It's pretty simple. The Constitution's lack of specificity also provides the opportunity that states could allocate their electoral college votes through some other means. For example, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, also known as the NPVIC, is an agreement among states to ensure that the candidate who wins the national popular vote becomes president. Since 2008, 15 states and the District of Columbia have joined, committing their electors to vote for the popular vote winner nationwide, even if that candidate loses in their state. However, the compact would only go into effect if enough states join to reach an electoral majority of 270 votes. Right now, it's still 74 electoral votes short. But the NPVIC has a few big hurdles. First, there's no guarantee voters would support their state's electors voting against the state's choice. Second, there's no binding law to stop electors from ignoring the national vote. And finally, based on a recent court ruling in Baca versus Hickenlooper, if the NPVIC did reach 270 votes, it would likely face serious constitutional challenges. In other words, the only surefire way to get rid of the Electoral College in its entirety would be to amend the Constitution. Of course, this would be no small feat. According to the Brookings Institute, amending the Constitution, quote, is a laborious process, and a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College would require significant consensus, at least 2/3 affirmation from both the House and Senate, and approval from at least 38 out of 50 states. But Congress has nearly reached this threshold in the past. Congress nearly eradicated the Electoral College in 1934, falling just 2 Senate votes short of passage. Given the era of division we currently live in, I don't personally see an amendment to get rid of the Electoral College being passed anytime soon, especially considering it requires approval from at least 38 states. Maybe someday we'll get to that point, but for now, I'd expect the Electoral College to stick around for a little while longer. It would just be too difficult to get rid of it at this current time. That's about what it comes down to. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I originally planned this video with the idea that Trump may win the Electoral College but lose the popular vote again. Regardless of that, the abolition of the Electoral College is still a uniquely American debate. It's seriously fascinating to compare how the United States chooses its leader compared to other countries. Nearly no other country, apart from a select few, can even begin to relate to what the American electoral process is like. In this video, I presented the best arguments on both sides as to whether the United States should get rid of the Electoral College or not. However, that doesn't mean I was able to cover every single one. If you think there's something that I should have mentioned, let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Like all of my other videos, all of my sources for this video are down in the description below. Please feel free to check them out if you're interested. I would highly recommend doing so, especially if you want to learn more about the topic at hand. Alright, that's all I've got for today. If you enjoyed or learned something new, please feel free to like and subscribe. More videos coming soon. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your continued support. I really appreciate it. Hope I see you next time. Take care.